Oh, thank you for this. This is an extremely kind introduction. Coming after Chuka, who's my MP, by the way, is always quite hard. But of course, what you did get from Chuka was a political view. But of course, economics and politics are so linked right now. They always have been, of course. Political economy is what people are talking about. But it hasn't been quite so pronounced, so that every speech is analysed and the implications for business are therefore attempted to come out of that speech that whoever has made. And what, of course, we do know is that businesses are trying to just look at what is being told to them as perhaps a hint of where we might be going in the future. So we've been in a very, very uncertain environment. And in that environment, I have to say, economists find it quite hard to predict what's going to happen. It's not just Chuka who can't quite say exactly how people will vote in the future. But of course, what the economy does might influence it. But it just gets so complicated. And up to a point, you can agree with Michael Gove when he said, why are we listening to experts? We don't really trust them at all. I was thinking about the trust figures that you had out there. But what you do as an economist is you look at what happened before. You're assuming that policy is going to be sensible. Just bear in mind that a lot of economics is based on rational expectations. So we think that you guys are rational, that you will, when you see prices go up, you might not buy as much, and when prices go down, you might do more. And when your jobs are under threat, you do something else. And when you're fearing about the future, you might save a little bit more, et cetera, et cetera. Well, and then you do the opposite quite often. In fact, consumer spending and the consumer function has always been the most difficult function of any of the models we've ever put together. Now, of course, models, who talks about models? David Davis thinks they're useless anyway, so he doesn't even read his impact assessments that have been done on sectors. But it is actually quite useful to be able to tell from past experience what people will do in the future when actually in one particular area you don't know what they, we don't know why they did what they did last time. It's a bit difficult to do it. And globally, I'm afraid, it happens as well. So let's see what has been going on in terms of the world economy. I mean, after all, we're doing reasonably well right now. Bear this in mind. I mean, I was on the radio this morning talking about how the pound has been strengthening a little bit because of growth being reasonably good. But of course, a lot of it is because of the fall of the dollar, where they're pursuing a low dollar policy to improve their current account position. But the world matters hugely. This is what's going on right now. Exports are improving, mainly because the world is growing. Now, what about the experts? What have we been saying? Well, we haven't been very good, as you can see from this. Now, the way you have to read this slide, and of course, being an economist, we produced a rather difficult slide for you to see, so just so we can prove that these things really are difficult to get to and you have a bit more respect for us, but actually, we get it wrong constantly. So, and what tends to happen is that if things don't quite go well in terms of your forecast for this year, well, it will happen next year. So you just postpone it. I'm afraid this is something that happens all the time. So if you just look at what the consensus was thinking, at the beginning of 2013 about what growth would be in 2014. Well, we all thought, well, things are picking up. Financial crisis is over, and it's all going to be fantastic. I mean, after all, interest rates are low. The world confidence is beginning to improve. Even, emerging markets are doing reasonably well with their heads at the time, and the developing world was beginning to grow. The developed world was beginning to grow again after the financial crisis. Anyway, so we thought it would be near 4.5%. Through the year, of course, data was coming in, and Chuka talked about data. And of course, we realized that actually it's not going to happen. So everyone was downgrading their forecast. But you can see that the downgrade happened quite slowly. So at the beginning of 2014, we already downgraded what would happen in 2014 as a whole. We had another 12 months to go. And through the year, of course, we thought, well, actually, things are not proving to be quite right. And of course, we ended up with 3.4% growth in the end. Now, the difference between 4.5% growth in the world economy and 3.5% growth, which is nearly 1 point, actually was a bit below 4.5% what we started with, is huge. I mean, if you just look at the correlation between advertising spend and growth, it is enormous. That's basically what determines it. So you can see what it means for an industry. if indeed the world grows more slowly, and considerably more slowly than that. So 1 point actually matters. Well, I'm afraid we didn't quite learn. We started slightly lower, saying, well, it's not going to be quite 4.5 as we thought before. Let's say just over 4%. It carried on like that for the following year, 2015, where again we were hugely disappointed because there's another nearly 1 point reduction from what we thought originally. In effect, what actually happened in 2015, 2016, similarly. I mean, look at that. We started at practically the same rate. We postponed it by a year. All right, it's going to happen next year. And there we are again with 3.2%. Well, you can see that even economists learn a bit. It's taken us a few years. So we started 2017 saying, come on, you guys, we'll lower it a bit. And actually, we started a more sensible place. And we actually ended up not too dissimilar from what we forecast. So what have we done this year? Well, I can tell you, this year we've played it safe. We've said 3.6%, that sounds all right, that's what we're going to get. What is going on right now? Everyone is saying, you've underestimated it. So Jim O'Neill and others have come up and said 4% probably world growth this year. But we haven't quite adjusted our forecast yet, just being a bit cautious. So for once, we want to be right, and it would be interesting if we were. But why are we seeing this optimism? The reason is that after a while when this wasn't happening, we've got a synchronized growth in world trade. You know, we went through 15 and 16 actually really worried for a while because we had quarters of world trade falling. And it carried on a little bit at the beginning of 2017, and then it actually improved. But what has happened? Remember the financial crisis. During the financial crisis, the developed world really suffered. The good thing was that the developing world, so the BRIC countries that, again, Jim O'Neill was really very keen on, carried on expanding, and that sort of balanced things out a little bit. What happened after that, of course, is because the fall in the West was so considerable, oil prices came down, commodity prices came down, lots of the emerging markets did badly. That included Russia, Brazil, etc. And that, of course, meant that trade wasn't growing anything like as fast. And then, of course, what you got after that is that, the West started growing again, oil prices have started increasing, some of those countries have come out of the recession, so we're having a coordinated expansion in imports and exports, which is good news. Now, why am I focusing on this? And of course, we heard Liam Fox before. The interesting thing is that people, you go to lots of conferences, which are usually, I don't know, about human rights and everything like that. And I was at some conference at the Barbican over a couple of days. The biggest audience that turned up in this very sort of young sort of people's thing, run by the Institute of Ideas, was the one we had on trade. I mean, suddenly trade has become fashionable as an issue to go and get excited about. And why is this? Because I think there's finally the realization that this is what matters. And here we are, Brexit negotiations. It is trade that is going to determine how we do in the future. Being open matters hugely. Putting any restrictions actually leads to reductions before. Why were there problems before? There were sanctions, wars, protectionism up to a point, and here we have America again, becoming a bit more protectionist, imposing lots of tariffs on the Chinese, maybe rightly in some ways, but we are at a point where this tide might turn if this protectionism bandwagon continues. But for the moment, 2018, we can be fairly certain that things are going to be reasonably good. And look what's happening in individual areas. Again, why are we optimistic? Or rather, why is everyone else optimistic? And the economists are going to get there eventually. It is because if you look at the regions, as I said, the synchronized growth, the most interesting one of all is the euro area. This is the area we're going to leave because of, this was a declining area, declining region, which, was tying us to them, whereas all the other regions are so wonderful and doing various things. But we do know that we export 45% of our goods and services there. They, of course, only export about 7% of them. And that's why we don't have many cards, unfortunately. But what is going on is that actually activity is expanding at the fastest rate in 12 years. And that's extraordinary because, of course, given that we export a lot to them, we have benefited hugely from this, which is, if it carries on, something good for us to look forward to, despite all the political problems. The Catalan issues, the German not having a proper government for ages, and so on. There are still concerns. There's Italian elections coming up. I mean, Greece, where I come from, is always a problem. But there we go. But overall, the markets have shaken that off, and there is, the effect of huge monetary easing that's taken place over a number of years has finally worked itself through. If you look at the US, it's interesting, although there's been a bit of a slowdown in the last month. I borrowed the slides from Trading Economics. They do these amazing comparisons, which are visibly very good to see. Now, you probably can't tell what's going on, but what is happening is that overall, of course, we've seen what's going on with the Dow Jones Index. It's gone up by 30% in a year. But what has also been happening is that, it's not just the big firms, the small firms are also feeling a lot more confident in the US. Tax cuts and so on might help them. But also the world economy growing is not a bad thing, even though they're not anything like as open to the world as other countries, perhaps. But what you have is that a small index confidence has been rising overall, and it's the highest average also for the year on record. So 2017 has done incredibly well for the US. So what's going on is that, indeed, finally the IMF has come up with a new forecast. It believes, it just came out a couple of days ago, brighter prospects, the global economy growing faster in 2018 than 2017, and you see also, the advanced economy is doing okay, but a lot of it coming out of the emerging markets and developing economies. But overall, the picture is one of growth. Now, of course, you may argue, why are we doing so badly? Well, if you are a mature economy, you can't actually grow very much faster than that. Actually, it's pretty good. Because there is a limit. You've employed your people. Well, yes, there is still a lot of unemployment in Europe. You can do a little bit better. But you're not like the other countries which are starting from very low productivity, and suddenly, the world is out there and they're getting new technology that wasn't there before, and access to markets, which they didn't think they had before, and they train their people. So growth can be considerably faster in those other countries. So that's what's going on. So we can start the year with optimism, and we heard Liam Fox there. Of course, he'd love to do trade deals with all these people. Now, the only real problem we have to watch is that trade with Australia accounts for only 1% of our trade, even if we have a nice deal. With India, we keep saying that we'd like to have a trade deal with. In fact, it was the UK that stopped the deal with Europe, with India and the EU, because, of course, the Indians said, yes, great, but if we open up our markets, we want to also have all our people have free visas to come and work there, and students, and so on. So, of course, the UK said no. So the likelihood of having a proper deal ourselves with India when we leave the EU is most unlikely. But they do matter, and of course, they are growing areas. So what has the UK done within this context? I said already, growth in the world economy, growth in Europe, fantastic for us. And indeed, we probably now have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the OECD, which is the rich countries of the world. We've seen the latest figures, which just came out yesterday. Real boom again in employment. A lot of it, of course, the people we saw in the video earlier, coming from Europe and elsewhere, but also UK-born workers. So that's really good news. Of course, the question is what types of jobs they are. Are they the sort of highly paid one? I mean, I have to say, I was reading City AM on the tube on the way over, and there is, I mean, of course, the creative sector and the area we're looking at is both marketing as well and advertising and so on, where you'd be interested to know, those of you who have not read it, that marketing manager is the first in best jobs ranking. That's the headline. So you must be doing something right in terms of the people you have. And obviously, some of the marketing people have benefited from this huge increase that's taken place. So that's been good news. But what has been happening is that the consumer, despite that, because the jobs aren't quite the high-paid ones, because of very high inflation, are not actually feeling particularly confident. In fact, as of the end of 2017, in the UK, consumer confidence had come down. And of course, we all know why. Higher inflation because of the low exchange rate, although that's changing against the US, although not against the euro, had actually squeezed real disposable incomes since wages are rising more slowly than inflation, even though, again, the data yesterday suggested that perhaps wages are now growing by 2.5%. The inflation being at 3% still means there is a gap. Now, I spoke to you about the consumer before and how we can't tell what they're going to do. Well, I mean, in this particular case, of course, they borrowed, or they have been borrowing quite extensively in order to continue to finance their spending. Of course, retail sales, if you remember, unfortunately, went down last month. But of course, there is a bit of a seasonal issue there. But basically, they bought everything in November rather than December. But you do see the squeeze in consumer spending more generally, which has happened because, of course, of the squeeze in real disposable incomes. And we haven't had a period like that in ages, where real disposable incomes are falling. And of course, what's going on? The Bank of England is now terribly worried about this and is making the banks have extra capital set aside for lending. And of course, they made mortgages more difficult to get, as you probably have seen. Actually, mortgages have not been rising anything like as fast as before. Again, people worried about house prices, which are either stagnant or falling in London, depending on which index you look at. So yes, we have a high employment, but interestingly, there are things underlying the economy which aren't quite there. And people, for example, are not buying cars. Now, yes, there's a diesel issue. But it's interesting that car registrations are going down. They fell in the year for the first time, as you can see, for a while. Yes, the diesel, as I mentioned, but also it suggests some lack of confidence. The interesting thing and the more worrying thing about it is not so much what happens in the end, because the car production has actually been quite high. We've done incredibly well in terms of selling to Europe in particular. In fact, we're back to record levels in terms of production. It's been a fantastic couple of years on this. The problem is that the industry is just not feeling confident, and investment in the sector went down by a third last year. Now, you need investment to continue to grow, to be productive, of course, for the future. And if that doesn't happen, if you have a whole sector, despite the supposed agreements or whatever it is that Nissan got with Theresa May about Brexit after that, there is an underlying concern, particularly on the customs union front that we've been hearing from Chuka, given that we all know that one particular component, any component, on average, for the car industry goes in and out of the EU about 6 times. Now, if you have no customs union, that makes it very, very difficult indeed. So let's see how that develops. And then, of course, you have business. Again, you heard a little bit about that. What can business say? What can they do? Well, the interesting thing for me is that this was the January latest data, which showed, once again, a drop in confidence. I was, in fact, expecting that because we got to the negotiations for phase 1, businesses would be more confident for the future. Now, this could turn around very, very significantly. If this were to turn around because people think, actually, we're going to get a very soft Brexit, or the transition period will be such that nothing's going to change for a number of years, and we think perhaps we may be working towards a customs union of some sort, this could change very dramatically. And I go back to my original point. If there is such a feeling, then things would lead to perhaps higher investment in the future and a turnaround in terms of the types of jobs we have and a safer future for us as well. And we've already heard the CBI making very clear that they want a customs union of sort. They've been attacked by Boris Johnson and others for saying it, but actually this is what business wants. Businesses want to stay in the internal market as far as they can. But given that we are in this uncertain position, what's happened before, in fact, the phase 1 deal was negotiated, the Office of Budget Responsibility, it was mentioned by Chuka, Robert Choate, who runs it, they produced this forecast alongside the budget, and that was the November budget, where there was a downgrade of the economy. And if you think, for this year, and if you think of what the IMF has done, I showed you the upgrade in the data, it has upgraded all the European countries and upgraded the world. Guess which is the one country it didn't upgrade? The UK, where it left it more or less this growth, which is less than 1.5% for this year. And what it did is it downgraded 2019, took away 0.1. You may think, God, how can we ever be so accurate? But it is an indication of their concerns. Now, the interesting thing is, again, think about politics experts and so on who are trying to look at politics and try and make some forecast. It is very, very difficult to do a forecast by making assumptions about what policy behavior is likely to be. And you just don't know. So this is why quite a lot of the forecasts can be a bit out, particularly for the longer term. So we're playing it safe. Most of the forecasts you'd see, including the OBRs, have 1.5, 1.3, 1.5% growth for the next few years. Now, the interesting thing is, why is it so low? And I think it is actually worth thinking about the underlying issues. I mentioned investment and the concerns that we have. it is that there is an issue of productivity in the UK economy. I'm not suggesting it happens in your sector, and I'll show you data in just a second. But we are the one country which has seen the worst productivity performance since the crisis. They all had less productivity in the period after the crisis than before. But in many cases, not that much worse. For our case, it was. Now, what happens? There is an arithmetic there which says that if your output grows less slowly than your increase in employment, then your productivity is reduced. What a worker produces, or even per hour produces, goes down. Or at least, so this is the one issue. And indeed, we suffered a fall in productivity. Because businesses have done the right thing in this country, in my view, there's nothing really wrong with it, as long as it doesn't last forever and there's no investment, because investment fell very significantly. Which is that you engage people because it's easy to hire and fire them, they're cheaper than perhaps some capital investment, and less risky. And that has kept us going, actually. It has kept us going for quite some time. And there is nothing wrong. You can make that decision. It wasn't a government decision. It was a business decision, probably very sensible. And of course, what they also realized, that your sector in particular, is that if you do have people in employment, they're going to spend. So it's one of the reasons why advertising has stayed high during that whole period. Of course, it's changed the way it does things. But it is a differentiator. If you look across Europe, they have much higher unemployment than we do, because they haven't quite gone down the route that we have done, because the labour legislation is considerably harder than ours, and we can make a value judgment as to which is best. But you see what Macron is saying. He wants to change regulation in Europe. Actually, he wants to change it everywhere, not just in France, to make the EU more competitive that way. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But of course, we do worry, additionally, about where this extra employment, if we continue down that route, is going to come from. A lot of it was coming from the EU, as I mentioned before. And in fact, we do depend quite significantly. Now, if you try and read those, this is the UK's reliance on labour from the EA, which includes, of course, Norway, for example. Not a huge number of Norwegians here. But it also shows you in the blue bar what the issues are for London in particular. Again, it was mentioned, London was mentioned a lot in the original film that you showed, where, look at professionals, managers and directors and skilled people and so on. I mean, that is a big issue here. It matters for your industry, but it also matters for areas such as construction. And one of the worries has always been, and the financial sector, of course, in particular, what happens if we haven't actually got that type of support in the future. Now, I don't think there is much point in me telling you about your sector, except to show once again how wrong one can be. So if you see here, the forecasts were for stagnant growth in the UK in ad spend in 2017. So I put a question mark. That seemed very odd at the time, and of course it didn't happen. The question is, of course, what happens in 2018? Given all the points that I mentioned to you before, it should actually indeed be going up again. And global advertising expenditure is going up, so the world is continuing to grow in that respect. A lot of growth in those emerging markets that I mentioned to you before. And there are some special issues in the UK that we can be quite proud of, even though it actually causes some concerns too, because we are right ahead of everyone else in terms of online spending, and of course the advertising that goes that way and the revenues that are earned that way also distinguishes here in the UK from others, because we are so much more into this. I mean, it raises all sorts of issues. There are all the issues of trust that we've spoken about before, concerns about sort of fake news and all that sort of stuff. But there is no doubt that globally, expenditure is shifting to digital generally. And given that we are leaders, we should all in this room have considerably greater chance of being more competitive in that area than others. So the prospects look certainly good from that perspective, but they do bring some issues with them, and this is, of course, the data protection legislation, which is coming through, the privacy legislation from the EU, effective from May this year. What will happen afterwards when we leave? If we leave, what happens during the transition period in this area? Do we accept everything, or are we going to be any different? There are issues, of course, for the firms for which the ads perhaps are done because of the way in which some of the data can be used. For example, if you try and transfer it to a firm outside the EU, which may be us, or to a locality, and do any of the EU data there, then you fall foul of the new legislation. So how to cope with it? Firms are not ready for it. It's been delayed anyway in some areas. So there are big regulatory issues coming through, plus, of course, what the advertising content and what there is that goes through Facebook and everything else. So there are issues that we need to grapple with. But of course, it is an important sector, and it is okay for Liam Fox to say we care for it a lot. But the question is it necessarily understood, and is anything done for it? Of course, why should there be government intervention in many areas? Let the industry flourish as is. But the reason why it is important is because it does create lots of jobs. You heard a little bit of that. And what it does is these are the jobs, which are both the ones it employs and the indirect impact it has, which is actually quite significant. The most surprising thing for me is why is Germany any better in this than me? I have no idea. But that's what the data that Deloitte has put together suggest. But it is a very important sector. What is one doing about developing it further? And you heard again the £6 per £1 spent. The interesting thing for me again is some of the other countries seem to be doing even better than that. And again, why is that? I'm sure you have the answers. I don't necessarily. But this is a very interesting slide that still suggests that the industry as a whole is very important and needs to be supported. Of course, we say a lot. When I was working for the Department of Business, we actually, my department and my group, produced the first slides to present to government of the importance of the creative sector, which hadn't quite been put together in that way. It matters. I mean, the talent that we have in the sector matters hugely. And I think this is quite interesting because it is a very productive sector. When you look at the right type of people who work in it, as I mentioned already, they're good jobs. They're very qualified. If you look at the sector, it seems to have loads and loads of graduates. The interesting thing on productivity, and that perhaps needs to be spelled out a lot more, is that even if you look at regions, actually, if you particularly look at regions, there is a very close link between the number of graduates who work in a region and the productivity. So the GVA, the gross value added of a particular region. So any industry that really isn't the type of jobs that we're worried about, the gig economy and so on, but actually is one that encourages the degree level entrance and also pays a good salary. Again, I looked actually a little bit on what is paid in the sector, depending on particular, and it was actually considerably higher than the average that is paid for graduates, for example. And I thought that was actually rather good. So there are issues that need to be perhaps argued even more strongly when one is thinking of what perhaps a post-Brexit scenario might have. But of course, it's also a sector that has to deal with tighter regulation in terms of content, the use of data and so on that I mentioned, and the issues of trust that I discussed before. So I'll stop here and open it to questions. Thank you very much.